Alrighty, welcome back to Art for O.U.R's YouTube channel. I've been thinking a lot about this, about trees, the theme of trees. I've tackled a number of projects in the last year concerning that, and it still intrigues me. So I thought I'd give another swing at this wire tree in a vase idea. The wire tree aspect is pretty simple, actually. As you saw, there's 22 gauge copper wire. They've got two versions, one that's treated so that it doesn't oxidize, and the one that does. This one was treated so it shouldn't do too much oxidization. That being said, in resin, I can't imagine it would anyway, but you never know. The idea with these trees is you just pick the length you want. As you twist the wires together, you start to lose length. Obviously, as you twist it together, the wire becomes more and more compact. And it's cool because you can choose the detail of the tree you want. Big branch here, little branch there. I have found that I cannot find a little tree in nature to fit what I'm looking for, so I had better luck just making it myself. What I use usually is a either a skewer, a cooking skewer, or like a Chinese chopstick. Cut a tiny little groove in the end of it, tape it and reinforce it, and then just use that to twist the ends near the branches that you want to look like leaves, and then you just kind of mess with it as wanted. I've seen people do little bits of paint in it to make it look like it's fall colors or green or whatever, but a lot of options there. At least you've got control over what shape and style of tree you want to make, which is kind of nice. The idea for this project came from the idea that you see trees, obviously, but you never see their roots. I was messing around with my kids in their sandbox the other day, and we had a bunch of little tree saplings that had sprouted in there because it had been a while. And because it was in sand, you could pull it out and see this perfectly preserved root system, which is as ever complex as the top of the tree is. And I thought, you know what, we ought to do a project that gives a nod to the roots of a tree. And you'll notice the shape of this overall project is kind of a gentle egg shape. And I don't know, you could take this analogy a million different directions, but roots, I feel like as a society, as a world, some groups of us have lost track of our roots, where we came from, and what keeps us together, what keeps us strong. Kind of worries me at times, but I know there are people out there who understand what I'm talking about and keep the important and healthy and good traditions are alive in our societies and our religions intact, so that we don't lose the foundations that we've built our societies on, the good parts anyway. Anyway, back to wood turning. This is another chunk of that a massive willow tree that died in my yard when we first bought our place here in Utah. There's a massive weeping willow tree. We're talking the base is about 4 or 5 feet across, the trunk. And unfortunately, it was mostly rotten and dying, and so eventually we cut it down. And the wood is beautiful if you can find a piece that's not too rotten. I love the color that comes out of it, and the grain's pretty sweet too. So that's what this is. Now, any experienced wood turner is going to look at this and go, "Yeah, you're crazy. Something that cracked is dangerous," and you would be absolutely right. So the reason I was willing to go forward with this is I knew by the time I got down into the cracks where it might actually come apart, I would have poured it in resin. And the way I do my resin pouring, you'll see in a minute, it allows for resin to get into the cracks everywhere and stabilize what otherwise would have been not the best kind of wood. Initially, my plan was to make a globe, kind of tie this analogy of roots and global peace and all that stuff together, but turns out my tree was so big that to get into a globe, the wood had to have been absolutely massive. So it turned into an egg, which is fine. I was actually happy with that. An egg obviously symbolizes life and rebirth and all that, so you can take this as far as you want. I love looking at this project. It has a lot of meaning. For the hollowing out or carving part of this, I use a number of tools. You'll see a round, really aggressive burr that's mounted on just a regular handheld drill. I like that thing. It was pretty aggressive, but time and time again, I keep finding myself coming back to the grinder with these carbide tipped cutting discs on there, carving discs. Much more dangerous approach for sure, but if you're experienced with it and you're careful and you always lead with the appropriate edge, boy, that thing removes wood in a hurry and saves a lot of time. But that burr was super helpful. My other favorite tool is this file sander. You can put different kind of grits of sandpaper on there, but it lets you get into corners that you just can't get in otherwise, to help shape and finish off the edges. One thing that's really tricky about this kind of project is how deep to make the windows, how finished the edge needs to be at what angle, because when you start to turn it, different parts of it start to show up. You start losing part of the subject that you put in the window, so you kind of have to work through the geometry of the thing and really think about it. Certainly a lot of trial and error, and every single one of these projects that I've attempted, by the time I'm done, the thing I've got is not ever quite what I envisioned, but something I'm really happy about. So kind of a tricky thing. Starbond is one of the sponsors. They donated a fair amount of CA glue, super glue. It comes nowadays with an accelerant, so you stick the glue on, spray the accelerant on it, and it sets up within seconds. So anything you lose in your project or something you're trying to stabilize, it's really, really awesome. In this project, I wanted the roots and the top of the tree to have equal focus. I wanted it to be obvious that sometimes the thing we see is not all of the story. I think that goes for a lot of us humans. Alright, back to my resin pouring technique. This is just a cardboard box filled with a garbage bag. This is floor padding used in construction. They put it under hardwood floors and that to dampen the noise. It doesn't stick to resin that much, so it's awesome to get off. And you just nestle your project into the sand and then pack sand around that as tight as you can. I use some clips where the folds are inevitably going to form. So the whole idea here is to bury the sand, or bury the project in the sand deep enough that it can't float. Otherwise, your wood project's going to float to the surface like a cork, and you'll be really sad, and you'll have a lot of resin waste on the bottom. But I like this technique because it allows for the resin to have a thin layer go all the way around the project, and fill up any cracks and gaps. This is the amazing deep pour resin by O.U.R. My regular sponsor is Total Boat, which has an awesome fathom deep resin, and I ran out of it with some of my projects this month, so O.U.R, I had some of that left over from previous projects, and it's great. Both of these resins, what they bring to the table is they take a long time to set up. over 24 hours. And what this allows for is for the resin to soak into the wood so you don't get bubbles, or at least not nearly as much. If I can't get a project into my pressure pot, I have turned to my vacuum chamber, which is absolutely phenomenal. It gets rid of all the micro bubbles that I fought for a long time as I've learned how to use resin. And what you do is you put it in a pot, get the biggest one you can, and run it through a whole series of vacuuming out the air. And you'll see that these bubbles get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually you get all of the air out of the resin completely. And then you pour it on your subject, your project, and even if you get bigger bubbles that form because of the turbulence of pouring it on your project, they'll rise to the surface no problem. It's the micro bubbles that I just could not get rid of, and this vacuum chamber did it. It's awesome. So the combination of a long setting resin, Alumilite or Total Boat are awesome. Plus the vacuum chamber has absolutely done it. The next stage of my progression here is to treat my wood beforehand to help get rid of the bubbles that come out of the wood, which is a different problem. I usually don't have much of an issue with this style of project because I'm only pouring an inch or two deep, and usually there aren't too many bubbles. But when I'm doing it in a pressure pot or doing it vertically because it's a taller project, the bubbles coming out of the wood can be an issue. You know, something start breaking loose late in the game and you get a string of bubbles. That's another tricky thing. This is a good example of where I didn't pack enough sand around the project. It floated just a little bit, so I wasted a bunch of resin on the bottom of it, but there were a lot of deep cracks, so it wasn't a total waste. Helped stabilize the whole thing, and in the end you'll see some deep arcing cracks all the way through the wood. And you know, you don't always have a big chunk of perfect wood that you want to burn on this kind of project where you know you're going to be cutting big holes in it, so kind of lets me use crappy wood to make cool projects. And quite frankly, I love the cracks. I love the reality that most wood you find in nature is pretty blemished. Now, a couple of things I discovered with this project. This is probably the biggest resin project I've done, and because there was only windows on one side of it, and there was big windows, fair amount of resin in there, that's a lot of weight compared to wood weight. And I've got a Laguna 1836 lathe, which is pretty heavy. I can barely move this thing. I'm not a big guy, but it's got to be at least 300 or 400 pounds. That offset weight is enough to make this baby wiggle, and you'll notice on my RPMs there on the left that I'd never get above 500 because it would make the whole thing jump around. So that presented a number of issues because that's a pretty slow RPM for me anyway. It slows the project down a lot, and especially in the finishing times when I was sanding and using a scraper in that, it literally doubles your time if you're at half the speed you're used to. And it also makes for not as smooth of a finish. Although on this one I was actually pretty happy with the finish. That was one thing I really struggled with. I'm not used to slow speeds. That's a hard one to deal with. I threw up a quick blip there for art for O.U.R. We've got over 74, I think, artists who've donated all kinds of stuff, from jewelry, woodworking, painting, hats, knitting, you name it. Christmas time's coming up, so take a look at what we've got. Everything that you buy anywhere from 75 to 100% of the proceeds go to Operation Underground Railroad, which is an amazing organization that goes around the world, within the United States and the whole world, looking for children who are stuck in the slave trade of sex trafficking. They identify these kids, work with local law enforcement to free them, get them into better adoption situations or back to family if they've been abducted. And it's an amazing thing. It's a very expensive process, so anything you can spare would be absolutely fabulous. Anything I raise goes to them. This is just something I do in my spare time, and kind of gets me out of my job of surgery and medicine, which can be stressful. And it's nice to go in the garage in the evenings and just destroy a piece of wood, you know? Very therapeutic. You'll see me using a simple hollowing tool here. It's a mechanical arm that's mounted onto the lathe bed. And this project, which is about 1.5 feet plus tall, pushed it to its limit. It couldn't quite reach the bottom of it, so I couldn't quite get the finish I wanted. But you know, now I know my limits for this thing. Now I could go bigger, but the problem is this was kind of a hollow form project, meaning the neck, the opening here was smaller than the actual inside. So you can't get in there and work around, you can't get access, and so you're kind of stuck supporting it from the very front of the project in, and that means you're in there quite a ways, and the further you are in there, the more it jangles around and it can get very unstable. So safe to say I have now found the limit of what that can do. 18 inches is a little terrifying. It works wonderful for even bigger projects that have a wide opening, so I can get in there with my tool rest situated further in. But yeah, everything's got their limit, and I tend to find that really quickly for some reason. The Laguna company was awesome enough to donate this light. It's tough as nails, big long boom arm. You can stick it where you need to. One thing that's really hard to capture with my amateur film setup is what I'm doing with that light. I'm shining it through the windows so that I can see inside, and it helps illuminate inside, because the opening's so small I can't shine it through the end very well, because that's where I'm working. And so even though it's spinning, there's enough light that gets in there that helps me see if I've reached the resin or not from the inside out. And because I couldn't get all the way in there really carefully and safely, I turned to this file lathe. This one's made by Wen, W-E-N. There's links to all this stuff in the description. But I ended up hollowing out the very bottom of it just so I could get exactly how much I wanted without coming through it. And this simple hollowing system comes with a laser guide, so you can tell how far you are. I'm currently too cheap to buy that, so I like to see what I'm doing and just kind of guess on the rest of it. Sanding wise, I usually go from around a 60 grit up to about 800, just regular sandpaper. And then I go from 600 up to about 2,000 with a wet sanding system. The one I found is probably quarter-inch, mounted on quarter-inch foam, which makes it really pleasant to work with when you're sanding. It helps get into the edges easily without hurting yourself. The reason I don't like using the different sanding solutions is because I use a lot of wood that's got cracks in it and character and different things, and man, all of those different products get into the cracks, so the buffing solutions and whatnot, and then I have to work on getting that out, clean it out. So just using the wet sanding system helps it save me time from having to do that. In case you're wondering, I've had people say, hey man, that'll get it a perfect shine. You're probably right, but in the interest of time, I hate getting it out of the cracks and all that. And in the end, I finish it with a teak oil, and you can hardly see a scratch on it. So I'm pretty content with that system for now. The traditional wood turning, where you're looking for a perfect piece of wood without cracks and holes, I'm sure those other products are absolutely awesome, but there's always holes and cracks with my style of turning, at least currently. As I mentioned before, Total Boat's an awesome sponsor of mine. They got that deep fathom resin, which I've been messing around with lately. It sets up in 2 or 3 days. It avoids that exothermic boiling and cracking problem that I've had before. And I've poured it up to 3 or 4 inches deep, which is pushing it. Got to watch the room temperature, otherwise you have problems. But between them and the Alumilite amazing deep pour, I have been quite happy with what I've come up with resin so far. As always, thank you for your support. You guys are awesome. Could not do this without you. Every time you watch, subscribe, share my stuff, helps me generate funds for Operation Underground Railroad. I don't keep a penny of it. For me, this is just fun. It's a challenge. I love stretching my artistic wings, so to speak. So, see you on the next project, and I hope you stick around. Thanks.